Professor James Waller is the Cohen Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Keene State offers the only Holocaust and Genocide major in this country. He has held fellowships with the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and he serves currently as the Academic Program Director at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. At the Auschwitz Institute, Jim develops and teaches seminars designed to introduce diplomats and government officials from around the world to issues of genocide warning and prevention. Dr. Waller has held several visiting professorships, most recently at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He has been working there on the third volume of his trilogy on genocide, and I have it on good authority that it is entitled The Troubled Sleep, which I think is a wonderful title, and it should be out via Oxford University Press at the end of this year. Dr. Waller grew up in Atlanta at the height of the civil rights movement, and very early on, he questioned the social divisions and abject racism in the society around him. His graduate work at the University of Kentucky and his first books were on the topics of racism and prejudice in America. Before moving to Keene, Dr. Waller was a professor of social psychology at Whitworth University in Spokane. Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Waller has written 4 books and counting, and he's published close to 30 articles in peer-reviewed journals. His field work has included research in Germany, Israel, Northern Ireland, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and Colombia. He's been around. Professor Waller has been a highlight of this lecture series for many years, close to 10. His study of becoming evil is a modern classic in genocide studies. It is one of the critical analyses for this course and will remain so. A related text, Confronting Evil, appeared last year. His depiction of the insidious cycle of genocide demands our attention and alerts us to how a seemingly inconsequential series of events can snowball into genocide. At the heart of his study is the most essential question of this lecture series: how do we become evil? His work begs a chilling question for all of us: where next, and how can we stop it? Please welcome Professor James Waller.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you all for being here on such a beautiful day. It's wonderful to be back here. I was trying to figure out before Diane mentioned it how many years in a row I've done this, and I think it is close to 10. It's at least 10, I feel like. So 9? 9? Okay. I think the committee, every time I'm asked to come back, I'm deeply honored. I think the committee just keeps asking me back because they want to see if I'm going to get it right at some point. I keep coming back until I do it well, so we'll hope today's the day. I am particularly honored this semester to be asked to be here and to give the Harris lecture as well. As you can see, there's a long established history here, 35 years of dedicated and devoted work to the field of Holocaust studies and genocide studies, and most importantly to the prevention of those things. I love on the banner that was shown earlier the notion of trying to prevent the escalation of things, prejudice into genocide. Really what we're going to talk about today is the escalation of things that turn people like you and I, ordinary people, into people capable of committing the types of atrocities you've studied over the course of this semester. As Dr. Parnas said in the introduction, I am Director of Academic Programs at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, which we'll talk about as the time goes on today, but we have over the past 12 years educated now over 4,000 government officials, diplomats, military personnel, and security sector personnel from over 75 countries around the world on the types of issues you're studying in this course: what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and what they can do on the front lines, on the ground, to make a difference in the face of those warning signs. I also hold the Cohen Professorship of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Keene State is actually a sister institution of Sonoma State. We're about half the size. We're about 5,000 students. We get about 59 more inches of snow than you get, but we're a sister institution. Our distinctiveness, as Diane mentioned, is we're the only school in the country at this point still that offers an undergraduate degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Your distinction here, and what I want you to be proud of and I want you to feel appreciative about, is that for 35 years, Sonoma State has had a program like this. I have the chance and the privilege to speak at a lot of places around the country, around the world. There's no place that has this type of program, that has you working in 3 classes throughout the course of the week, and then you come together here every Tuesday, and you get to hear, myself excluded, you get to hear some really good people when you come here, and some really smart people, and some people who have done some incredible work. So I always tell people about this program at Sonoma State, and I know when you're here, you may feel like this is ordinary and it's typical and it's just part of the experience. Trust me, this is completely extraordinary, the opportunity you've had here over the course of this semester. So lucky for you, lucky for me to be here with you today. What we're going to talk about are issues really of human agency and the range of human behaviors. As Dr. Parnes mentioned, my training is as an experimental social psychologist. What has been said about the field of social psychology is that a social psychologist is someone who would go to a football game, and rather than watch the game, she would watch all the people in the stands, because that's what's of interest to a social psychologist. How does the presence of other people influence how I think, how I feel, how I behave? For me in the field of genocide studies, and I've been working and teaching now in this field for over 20 years, in those 2+ decades, what I've been fascinated by, and perhaps you've been caught by it this semester as well, is that in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, you see the range of human behaviors in the most extreme of human and inhuman situations. So all the things that we wonder about in terms of our capacities, how would we respond if, are questions that are raised when we study the Holocaust and Genocide. We look at the range of agency and human behaviors for victims. Victims, by their definition, have limited ranges of agency and choice when they're faced with genocidal violence. Many times, victims and survivors will tell you that the only agency and choice they had was the choice to try and live another day, to do whatever they could to live another day. They weren't going to topple the regime. It was difficult to fight back. It was difficult to resist. But if they could live another day, that's where they felt their choice was. Again, by definition, for victims, most of their agency and choice has been stripped away. Not overnight, but I'm going to go back to that magic word, escalation, because of an escalating series of events that over time have taken away a wide range of their agency. Bystanders also make choices. One of the phrases I very much don't like in Holocaust and Genocide Studies is the phrase passive bystander. There's no such thing as a passive bystander. When you stand by, you are making the active choice to stand by and do nothing in the face of violence, to look the other way and just to be glad that the violence is not directed against you. There's nothing passive about bystander behavior. That's an active, deliberate use of human agency to turn the other way when you see someone else being harmed, when you see someone else being threatened, when you see someone else being persecuted. Some people use their agency to resist and rescue. Not many, because the situation in genocide is that the power differential between the killers and everyone else, that power differential is so huge that it's difficult for people to find a way to resist and rescue. Dr. Goodman's done a good part of her work on issues of resistance and rescue, and she'll tell you the odds are stacked against this. I was on a panel years ago in Holocaust studies, and someone asked the question of the panel, why don't we see more cases of resistance and rescue in the Holocaust? And one of my co-panelists came out with what I thought was a great response. He said, if you understand the dynamics within the Holocaust and genocide, The question isn't, why don't we see more resistance and rescue? It is, how do we see any resistance and rescue? It's so difficult to do. The amazing thing is that we see anyone do it in these cases. What we're going to talk about today, though, is this final category. What about the people who actively choose to kill in the process of genocide? There's no such thing as a perpetratorless mass killing or genocide. When it happens because someone is actively choosing to kill someone else. One of the key things I want you to get from today, maybe you can fall asleep after you write this part down, is just to say and to hear that genocide happens because individual humans choose to kill other individual humans in large numbers and over an extended period of time. That's what genocide is. You can get caught up all you want in the bureaucracy and the technology and the T4 program and the Holocaust and everything else that goes with it. At the end of the day, an individual human being has chosen to kill another individual human being, and enough of them have done that, large numbers over an extended period of time, that we see the death tolls. 6 million, 800,000, 1.5 million, 1.25 million. So one of the things I want us to remember is that every one of those victims we have to think about individually. I have a colleague who teaches with me who teaches the Holocaust, and he never refers to the death toll of the Holocaust as 6 million. He always says 6,000,001. What is he trying to draw your attention to? The one. Because those 6 million, it's one, it's a second one, it's a third, it's a fourth. Every one of those 6,000,001 loved someone, they were loved by someone else, they had hopes, dreams, and aspirations that would never be fulfilled simply because they were Jewish, simply because they were Muslim in other cases, simply because they were Christian, simply because they were Tutsi, simply because they were Armenian, simply because they were this or that. That's the reason they lost their lives. And for every one of those victims, there is a corresponding killer. They don't die by accident. For every one of the 6 million, for every one of the 800,000 in Rwanda, there is a killer. And it's those killers that are going to draw our attention today. Now, when I say we're going to look at perpetrators here over the next 3 hours together, what I mean by that, you're laughing, you know it's true, won't be 3 hours. It'll feel like that, but it won't be 3. What we're going to look at when I talk about perpetrators is you can hear 3 different levels. Certainly there are perpetrators who are the architects of genocidal policy. They're the people who make policy, who develop policy. We can also talk about perpetrators as bureaucrats, like an Adolf Eichmann, who implement the policy, who push the paper, who do the work to make sure that the killing can proceed most efficiently. But the third category is what we're going to focus on, and that's the rank and file. The people who translate policy into practice. I was in Bogota, Colombia 3 weeks ago, and we were working with a group of about 30 Colombian officials. And if you know anything about Colombia, it's in the midst of a protracted peace process to try and end a 30-plus year civil war, and it's still very tenuous in Bogota and in Colombia. And I was talking a bit about this research on perpetrator behavior, and I was getting a little pushback from 2 of our Colombian colleagues who kept saying, yeah, we got to talk more about the architects. We got to talk more about the people who plan it. I understand that desire in Holocaust studies to focus on Hitler, to look at the mid-level bureaucrats like an Adolf Eichmann. I understand that desire, but for so long the field got caught up in that's all we knew about the people we called perpetrators. When I started teaching Holocaust studies, you'd read a book on the Holocaust, you'd close it, and at the end, if you're asked the question, who were the perpetrators, who did the killing, you'd have Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Eichmann, but someone should stop you and say, well, all of those men you just mentioned, they developed policy, they implemented policy, but they never killed anyone. They don't have literally blood on their hands from the killing. They're morally responsible, absolutely legally responsible, but who are the people who actually did the killing, who turned policy into practice? You'd close the book and say, I don't know. I don't know. We haven't talked about them. No one's looked at them. And I think for a long time, that was the state in genocide studies, that the most important people to the killing process, the killers, the people who pulled triggers, the people who swung machete, those were the people we knew next to nothing about because we focused on the architects, we focused on the bureaucrats. They are what we call in philosophy. I say we call in philosophy, I'm not a philosopher. What philosophers call architects and bureaucrats are necessary but not sufficient for genocide. So we have to have them. You have to have architects and bureaucrats, but if that's all you have, you're not going to kill a lot of people. You have to have the killers at the front line who carry out this hard work of killing. So for me, over the past 20 years, I have worked with trying to understand the psychology of these people who do this killing. This was, in the first edition of Becoming Evil, primarily archival work, mostly Holocaust-related, throughout Germany, former Eastern Europe. By the time I decided to write a second edition of the book, I knew that there were so many questions I had with the archives. Working with archives is a fascinating experience. How many of you are history majors? A few? Fascinating to be in an archive by yourself and you're reading stuff and you're touching stuff firsthand. But every time it came to perpetrator behavior, I had more questions I wanted to ask. And you can't ask those questions of the archive. The paper's not going to respond. Trust me, I've tried. It just doesn't give me any feedback. So I knew for the second edition, I needed to interview people face to face. And what that's meant for me is now 225 face-to-face interviews with killers in Argentina, Guatemala, Colombia, good number in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland, people who have killed and been sentenced, tried, convicted for the killings. Some cases like Serbia and the Republic of Srpska, people who have killed and have never seen justice, who actually today still work for the police, still work for the military. Some of them are high-ranking political figures in Serbia. So in these interviews, what I've tried to understand is this sense of escalation. What escalates for an ordinary person to become capable of committing these type of extraordinary atrocities? Many times in the interviews, when I'm in country, I spend just as much time with survivors, witnesses, bystanders, because I want to hear from them, how do you think your neighbors, your countrymen, your countrywomen, how did they come to perpetrate these atrocities? So I'll start today with one of the stories that comes from that event for me in Rwanda. In Rwanda, one of the things you have to understand is that one of the first series of Hutu massacres against Tutsi occurred from 1959 to 1962. And in those series of massacres, often what Tutsi husbands and wives and mothers and fathers would say to their loved ones is, flee to the church. If you go to the church, if you go to the mission compound, you'll be safe there. In 59 to 62, that was pretty well correct. Relatively few Hutu killers came into those grounds to kill Tutsi. So on April 6, 1994, when President Habyarimane's plane is shot down, Tutsi husbands and wives and mothers and fathers, as they see the killing start to begin, say the same thing to their loved ones. Go to the churches, go to the mission compounds, you'll be safe there. And one of those churches outside of Kigali is in Tarama. At these churches and mission compounds, what would happen in 94 was very different than what would happen in 59 to 62. In 94, Hutu extremists had their own version of a final solution in mind. So what happened in these places is that the victims essentially rounded themselves up for the slaughter, thinking they were places of safety, thinking they were places of sanctuary, not ever thinking the killers would cross these grounds to do their killing. And in truth, the killers did cross these grounds to do their killing. Some of these sites, 3,000 dead, 5,000 dead, 8,000 dead. Today, if you visit Rwanda, and you ask to see sites of memory, many of those sites of memory are places like Ntarama. They're churches, they're former mission compounds where I've been to Rwanda maybe close to 10 times, 9, 10 times, and each time the site changes. I've seen these sites where the bones lay as they fell, and you didn't have to look hard to see the machete marks on forearm bones where people tried to fend off machete, to see skulls with bullet holes in them. Other times, those remains have been moved, placed elsewhere on the ground, sometimes given back to families, clothes hang there, wide variety of ways of remembering these events. One of the survivors I'd been introduced to during my time in Rwanda was willing to tell me her story. And when I interview survivors, they tell me their story, where they want to tell me, when they want to tell me, how long they want to tell me, whatever detail they want to go into, that's their choice. I'm not going to re-victimize them by grilling them in terms of testimony about their survival. This woman decided that for the first time, she wanted to go back to the place that she had survived, which is this church in Ntarama. She had fled there with her family. She had ended up by a window in the church. This is the church as you walk up to it today as a preserved memory site. She was by a window. The Hutu killers came in, and they began to rape, some, kill everyone. Most of the killing done with machete, some done with guns and ammunition. She was by a window. The window had been blown open by a grenade, so the killers could get in. She had some shrapnel wounds from that. But the large wound she had, as she took off her scarf, was a wound that ran pretty much from the front of the neck to the back of the neck. It was a machete wound. And you looked at it and you thought, I don't know how anyone survives a wound like this. She had been cut. She had been left for dead because the killers thought she was dead. As the killing went on, she gained enough strength, despite a tremendous loss of blood, to crawl out through this demolished window where she showed me, and she made her way to a small building behind the church, the backside of this building. This was a building that had been used for Sunday school education at this Catholic church. She made her way to the back of this building. She lost consciousness. And she says for about a day and a half, she remained behind this building, some of the time unconscious. Sometimes she'd wake up and she'd have some periods of consciousness. She'd lapse off, she'd lose consciousness again. The killers never found her there miraculously, but every time she woke up, she said, she heard the same sound from inside this room. And the sound was just a loud clap. She said it had a wetness to it, but it was a loud clap. She couldn't know what the sound was. She had heard machete hitting skin. She had heard machete hitting bone. She knew that sound. This wasn't it. She had heard the sound of gunfire. This wasn't the sound of gunfire, but it was just that clap. After the killers had left, she regained consciousness and she was able to make her way around the side of this church, and she looked inside the church. And this isn't what she saw. This is what you would see if you were there today. What she saw were several dozen children thrown across these pews, because again, this had been a classroom for Sunday school. These children had been killed in this room. How had they been killed? What was the sound she was hearing? Sorry? What she had heard is what you see here today. This isn't preserved, it's not archived. This is blood. The blood runs so deeply in this brick, it'll be there as long as the brick will be there. What had she heard over those hours? She had heard children being picked up by the feet and swung headfirst against a wall, killed in this way. After being killed in this way, tossed on the mound of bodies of other children who were in this room. Now, as grotesque and as extraordinary as this is, it's not creative in a sense. It's not new. American cavalry troops in the 1800s killed Indian children this way during westward expansion, picking Indian children and small women up, swinging them headfirst against trees or the side of a building until they were dead. It happened in the Armenian genocide. It happened in the Holocaust. If you visit Cambodia today and you're asked to see sites of memory, often you're taken to trees that are called killing trees, where children and small adults were picked up and swung headfirst against the tree. What's the benefit for killers of doing this? Why do we see this in so many cases of genocide? Good. It's an efficiency issue. In Rwanda, it means no bullets are used in the destruction of these children, and it means no machete is dulled in the killing. Because one of the things, as I've interviewed killers in Rwanda, is I'll speak often about killing, 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 then having to stop to sharpen a machete or get a new machete because the old one was dull and it was taking so long to kill someone. You're not spending bullets here. You're not dulling a machete. You're killing in the most efficient way possible. Now, if you had a friend on campus who hasn't taken this course and you describe some event like this to them, how do most of us think of the killers in this room? What are words that come to mind? Monsters? Crazy? Ruthless? Inhuman? Psychotic? Demonic? Sadistic? All of these ways we can explain these killers. But this case I picked to start us with because in my experience, this has been a much more typical case. I believe it was 4 years later, I was back in Rwanda in the central prison in the capital city of Kigali. I gained access to interview a group of perpetrators. One was coming out, and I can never remember honestly if I was late, he was late, something odd had happened, and I didn't have the time to read through his file before we sat down for the interview. I was working with a translator. A couple of minutes into the interview, something triggered for me in terms of memory about something he said, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. 5 minutes into the interview, it became very clear that this man I was interviewing just happened to be one of the killers at this church and in this room. Not only happened to be one of the killers, he happened to be the organizer of the killing in this place. Now, we could finish this time together very quickly and go out and enjoy a beautiful day if I could say to you who this man was, is exactly what you described. He's inhuman, he's a monster, he's sadistic, he's pathological, he's crazy, all these things. This man's story was very different, but I think very typical. He was from this village where the massacre had occurred, so he knew the people he was killing, he knew the people who were being killed. He was the equivalent of a grade school teacher in this village. When we asked him, were any of the children you killed in this room children you had taught? He said, yes. He was the soccer coach in this village. When we asked him, were any of the children you killed children you had coached? He said, yes. He was a member of this church where the killing took place. He had been a young altar boy in this church. He attended church regularly here at the church in the Turama. When we went back to the village to ask people about him, even family members of people he had killed said, he was a wonderful man. He was a kind man. He was a good man. We could never picture him doing something like this. So when we pushed him on what happened here that allowed you to start to kill people you had taught, you had coached, you had gone to church with, all he could keep saying was, I lost myself. I lost myself. I did not know who I was. Now, some form of that paraphrase I've heard in almost every perpetrator I've ever interviewed. I lost myself. I didn't know who I was. I just don't understand what happened. So understand that our job today, which is trying to figure out what happened, is a difficult one because even the people who did the killing don't know what happened. They don't know what transformed them into people who came to commit these type of atrocities. So 2 research questions for us. One is, how many people does it take to carry out genocide, mass killing? This is a tough one to be precise on because when genocide is over, who do we go after in terms of trials and justice? You're pointing upward? Who? Yeah, we go after, I'm assuming you're not pointing to God, so we'll say architects. Sometimes we go after God with hard questions, but who justice goes after are the architects, the big fish at the top. Some of the well-known bureaucrats occasionally justice will go after a really notorious rank-and-file killer, but by and large, the rank-and-file killers, they go back to doing whatever they did before the war started, before the killing started. This is not, I'll give this percentage as an estimate. This is just my experience from over 20 years in the field, is that probably something on the order of 95% of genocidal killers don't ever see justice. They're not going to see a courtroom. They're not going to go to prison. They'll go back to doing whatever they did before the killing started. Because most often we go after the architects, bureaucrats, and big names. Now, we have a couple of exceptions to that, but give us an idea. If we could make estimates, we can estimate in the Holocaust 600,000 Germans, Austrians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and others who were involved face-to-face in the killing in the Holocaust. In the former Yugoslavia, judges there will tell me that they think there are 26,000 Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, but probably about 90% of them Serbs, who should be in jail for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, who are never going to see the inside of a jail. Rwanda has actually been the most efficient and effective country at bringing its perpetrators to justice. Rwanda is a country the size of Vermont. 100 days, beginning in April 1994, 800,000 dead. You can take any 100-day segment of the Holocaust, you don't find that rate of killing. And this isn't done with high technology. It's machete, it's masu, wooden clubs with nails driven through them. It's some guns and ammunition, but pretty limited. 800,000 people in 100 days, that's a frenzy of killing. One scholar has called it a hurricane of killing. In Rwanda, the estimates, first time I visited, asked someone how many people were involved in the killing. They said maybe over 1 million Rwandans that somehow were involved in the killing. Eventually, I think we can settle on something close to 260,000 Rwandans who were involved face-to-face in the killing of other Rwandans in 1994. So even though we can't give exact numbers in every case, I think we can move forward saying for genocide to be successful, you have to have an awful lot of people at the front lines who are willing to pull a trigger, willing to swing a machete, willing to do what they have to do to carry out the processes of killing. So the second question then becomes, who are these people? And can we recapture the experiential history? In other words, can we step into their shoes and understand the choices they faced, the emotions they felt, the coping mechanisms they employed, the changes they underwent? I'm just looking at the slide for a second because this is so refreshing to me. Probably the last 10 times I've done some version of this lecture. The slide's in Spanish, Croatian, Bosnian, which is the same thing, but they pretend it's different, some foreign language. And I turn to the slide for help, and I have no idea what it's saying. So it's just nice for me to turn and say, oh, I actually understand those words. So this is the question we're asking, is can we understand the experiential history? Can we step into the shoes of the perpetrators to understand the choices they faced? It doesn't matter what choices we think they faced. That doesn't affect their behavior. What affects their behavior is what choices do they think they had and they faced. Let me give you a quick example. In Rwanda, we have hundreds of cases of killers who tried not to kill, who when ordered to kill by neighbors or friends or family would cut themselves on the thigh, hold up a machete and say, I have blood, I've cut a tall tree, I've killed, and someone catches them and say, no, you haven't killed, we're gonna watch you kill a Tutsi, and we'll stand by you and make sure you kill. If they didn't kill, they themselves would be killed. And again, we have many documented cases of that. They understood the reality of, if I don't kill, I may be killed. In the Holocaust, on the other hand, we don't have a single recorded documented case of a Holocaust perpetrator choosing not to kill and then himself being killed. We don't have a single case of it. But what did the perpetrators think might happen? What they thought might happen would be, if I don't pull this trigger, somebody's going to kill me. So that's what I'm interested in, is what choices do they think they had? Not what choices I think they had, the choices they think they had. What emotions did they feel? How did they cope? How did they undergo these transformations? A good part of our training through the Auschwitz Institute is on the grounds of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Our partner is the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. So we bring government officials, diplomats, and so on to Auschwitz for a week, and we hold our seminars on the grounds of Auschwitz. On day 2, they take their study visit to Birkenau for the afternoon, 4 hours at Birkenau. You've all seen images of Birkenau, you've studied a bit about Birkenau, and when they come to Birkenau, the largest of Nazi death camps, 1.25 million people conservatively died at Birkenau. Probably the largest cemetery in the world, most all of it unmarked. Birkenau was built on a swamp. So when I'm there in May and June, it's just mosquitoes everywhere. It's still swampland. How did the Nazis fill in some of the swampland? They took the ashes of the victims they killed, and they used those ashes for landfill. So there are parts of Birkenau you're walking on where you're literally walking on the grounds of the ashes of people who died there. Now, as our seminar participants come here, they do what they should be doing. They're looking inside Birkenau. They go inside the gates. They're looking at the enormity. It's 430 acres of this death camp that the Nazis meant to be there for forever. This wasn't a short-term facility. I've been there now so many times that once we have them through the gates and on the tour, I find myself looking the other way. And what I'm looking at the other way is across a 2-lane street. And on the other side of the 2-lane street is a row of houses. Some of those houses have been built since the war. Few of the houses were there during the war. But I know that during the functioning of Birkenau, at its highest functioning capacity, that there was a row of houses just a few hundred yards from the gates of Birkenau, and in those houses, the Polish citizens of Auschwitz were thrown out, and in those houses, the Nazi personnel of Auschwitz were housed. Some of them were single officers who were housed in dormitory-style settings in the houses. A good number of them were married officers who chose to have their wife and occasionally their children come to be stationed with them at Birkenau. And the question I find myself asking is, what are the coping mechanisms you use? When you wake up in the morning, your wife cooks you breakfast, you say goodbye to your children, you walk across this 2-lane street, and you walk into a place where the single purpose, the only reason your job exists, is to produce death. That's all you're doing there. It's not a slave camp. There's another one of those a few kilometers away at Buna. This is a camp for death. So in your work, you're killing. You're doing the hard work of killing. After 8 hours or so of that work, you leave the camp, you exit out through the front gate, cross the 2-lane street, and you go home. And at home, I can assume, I wasn't there, I can assume a dinner is probably waiting for you. Your children run and say hello. Maybe you kick a soccer ball around. You read them a bedtime story. You tuck them in. I can assume at some point you have relations with your wife over the course of the time there. This is your normal life. And the next day you get up and you go back to doing your work. And your work is killing. So the tough question for us is, how do people cope with something like this? How are people, what transformations do they undergo that allow them to commit these type of atrocities in these settings? Now, I'm going to be honest with you, and I'll come back to this at the end of our time together. There's a danger here, because I'm asking you for this time we have today to step with me into the shoes of a perpetrator and to understand their worldview from their perspective to try and help us understand how they came to do what they did. What's the danger of that? What risk do we run? Yes? Yeah, God, that's great. Where were you when I wrote the book? I could have used that sentence. Understanding might lead to empathy. So now I see where you're coming from, and maybe that leads to forgiveness. That's the risk we face. Now, I'm going to say, and again, I'll come back to this at the end, I know that risk. I see it here. But there's another risk we could face. If we don't choose to try and understand this, then the risk is what? Danielle? It's like 120 people in here. No one named Danielle? It's like statistically impossible almost. What's the risk? If we don't want to try and understand this, what do we risk? Impunity, and we risk, how do we stop it? If we don't understand how people, this escalation, if we don't know what the escalation is, we can't stop it. So I would rather avoid that risk and have to deal with the risk of, if I understand it, I've got to keep my moral mind open to say, understanding doesn't mean forgiveness. It's non-apologetic. It shouldn't lead to empathy. It certainly shouldn't lead to forgiveness, because that's not something that I'm in a position to grant. But understanding can lead us, hopefully, to a point of prevention. And again, we'll come back to that in a little bit. I'm not the first person to have asked this question of how ordinary people come to commit this type of evil. Other people have asked it before me. They have come up with different answers that I have found limiting or limited in trying to advance our understanding. So some people have said, for instance, it's just the nature of the collective, that when groups of people come together, bad things happen. How many of you have do you have fraternities here? Okay, so I probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but sometimes groups, fraternities, sororities, academics, politicians, groups come together and some pretty terrible decision-making and terrible things can happen. And a group of angry people come together and they just get angrier because they're together in a group. That absolutely happens. But groups of good people, fraternities, sororities, academics, politicians, good people can come together, and there's something about being together as a group that can also enhance that goodness of the world and how you want to change the world that you live in and how you want to challenge the world. So I want to be careful about the group piece. What I want to say is what groups do to people is they do what this microphone's doing to my voice. This microphone is amplifying my voice. What groups do is they amplify the tendencies of people within them. You bring together a group of angry, hostile, vengeful, prejudicial people. As a group, it's going to heighten those tendencies, and we know that. But you bring together a group of good, inclusive, tolerant, kind, caring people, and as a group, those tendencies can also be heightened as well. So I want to be careful about how we think about the group. In the same way, I want to be careful about how we think about ideology. When I say ideology, I'm talking about belief systems, what it is that you believe. Our tendency is to think that if I believe a certain way, then I behave a certain way. But one of the truisms of social psychology is that relationship between belief and behavior, that's all wackadoodle. That's not actually a social psychological term, that's just mine. But that relationship is not that easy. Sometimes what happens is we're used to thinking ideology drives behavior. But sometimes what happens is how you behave actually drives what you believe. Let me give you a couple of examples. When I was in college, late 1800s, the tendency when American historians wrote about slavery, what they said pretty much in one voice was America had this ideological racism, belief system of racism, and out of racism grew this practice of slavery. Today, actually, American historians look at that quite differently. American historians, by and large, say, we developed a system of slavery that was a wonderful, for the perpetrators, system of economic exploitation. And then we developed racism as an ideology because what did it do for us? It justified it. It made it right. So when we're hearing from our pastors and our teachers and our politicians that racism is a real thing and races are born biologically different, that justifies slavery. That makes it right. My experience with perpetrators has been that ideology works this way more often than it does the other way. That for most perpetrators, ideology comes after the fact. to justify the killing. Again, I'll go back to one of the perpetrators I interviewed in Rwanda, in Kigali, and we always ask questions about ideology and beliefs about Tutsi and so on, and he clearly hated Tutsi. He was sitting in prison for this. He clearly hated Tutsi. And he had all these myths and misconceptions about who Tutsi were and weren't and why they were a threat to Rwanda. And we said to him, how long have you had these beliefs? And he very quickly said, oh, I didn't get these beliefs until after I started killing Tutsi. So it's not why he killed Tutsi, it's just he started killing Tutsi for other reason. And in his case, it was they had a sheet metal roof that I wanted, or they had a goat, or a radio. That's greed. That's why he starts killing, and then to justify the killing, then he buys into all the ideological piece. So I want to be careful about ideology, and I also want to be careful because, again, in all the perpetrators I've interviewed, ideology doesn't take the same with every person. So if we're all raised in the same culture, same community, same ideology, it's not as if it's a stamp that stamps here the same, and here the same, and here the same, and here the same. Ideology is important for some people, but by and large, in my experience, it plays a relatively minor role as a reason for the killing. It plays a bigger role as a justification for the killing. And then finally, people look at, I think, two ways of thinking about personality. One way is I've called the Mad Nazi thesis. And the Mad Nazi thesis, and here I want to go back to my first comments, I'm a social psychologist. I'm not a counselor, I'm not a clinician. So I use terms that are more Jim's terms rather than psychological terms. So we use terms like crazy. That, for instance, is not a technical term, but it should get the point across. The thought in Nuremberg, or the Mad Nazi thesis, is that certainly the people who perpetrate these atrocities do so because they're crazy. They're pathological, they're disturbed in some way. That's why they do it. We actually had a chance to test this in Nuremberg, 45, 46. 22 Nazi leaders on trial, actually 21 make trial, one commits suicide in prison, Robert Ley. The 21 on trial, we have a psychiatrist and psychologist from the US and Great Britain who are able to, this is before the days of institutional review boards and human protections and so on, they're just able to walk down the hallways of the jail cells at Nuremberg and give out intelligence tests and personality tests to the people on trial at Nuremberg. These were architects. They weren't bureaucrats, they weren't rank and file, but they were architects of the genocide. So let's look at the testing that was done. First type of testing they used for these defendants was IQ testing. What's the average IQ score, do you know? Some psych major who can help us out? It's 100. Everybody's always hesitant to answer that one because you don't look good if you get that question wrong, the average IQ score, and then you just swing and miss on it, but it's 100. If you go to college and graduate, average IQ is around 110. If you go on and get a PhD, the average IQ is around 120. I work with PhDs, have all of my career. We're 80, 85 on our best day, I think. That's where we top out. But that's where IQs should be. Now, what are we hoping to see in the Nazis? What is the world, when they hear about the Nazis being tested for IQ, what do we hope to see in their results? Low? Why? Why? You're right, low. We want them to be stupid because why? You want to be able to give them a pass a little bit. You're right. It helps us understand if they're stupid. But it also, stupid, and again, these are not technical terms, stupid can be fixed. We can fix that. So what we're hoping to see in the IQ test is these men are pretty low intelligence because first, we understand it, and then secondly, now we can prevent it. We just have to help people think more clearly and more humanely and think more critically, and they'll never do anything like this again. Now, we should have known this wasn't the case. Germany at this time in history was a highly sophisticated, cultured, intelligent society, so the results shouldn't have been surprising to us. What were the results? All the men tested well above 100. Some of them were 120, 130, 140. Some of these men were almost genius level. So they weren't just average intelligence, they were really bright people who had perpetrated these atrocities. Now, in some ways, we could almost live with that in a way because we can kind of get around it, because what we still have is maybe they're smart, but they're certainly crazy. They're certainly pathological. And the test of crazy, I got a better way of saying that, the crazy test we use, that's no better at all, is the Rorschach test. The Rorschach is a series of 14 ink blots. If you've taken Intro to Psych, you probably all have seen this. 14 ink blots, it's from a family of tests called projective tests. The idea is that they're so ambiguous here that you will project your personality or your pathology into the answer. So no one's going to see this ink blot and say, I see a knife and my mother and blood. And I mean, it's never that obvious, unfortunately. But people who are trained in the Rorschach are able to actually read into the responses people give to determine different levels of pathology or mental health or adjustment within the responses. So several of the Nuremberg defendants took the Rorschach test. The Rorschach gets made fun of a lot in popular culture. You'll see it on the Watchmen movies and other places. But to be honest, in 1945-46, the Rorschach was the most commonly used test in the world of pathology. In 2017, the Rorschach was the most commonly used test of pathology in the world. So we poke fun at it a little bit in terms of pop culture, but it's our go-to test for pathology. What are we hoping to see in the Nazi defendants at Nuremberg? Sorry? Someone said something? Crazy. I wish you'd use more sophisticated terms. We're an intelligent community. Don't talk down to each other. Yeah, we're hoping to see crazy. And we're hoping to see pathology because, again, this goes back to your point. Now we understand. Crazy people did this, and we feel safer because we're not crazy and we're not surrounded by people like this, so it's a little bit safer. Yeah? Oh, just pathological, mentally disturbed, yeah, something like that. No, and again, I use it because I have very limited vocabulary, but pathological. That's what we're hoping to see. What do we end up seeing? We end up seeing, as a result of the Rorschachs, and we still have all these responses today. Every 10 years, some poor graduate student takes it on as a dissertation to see what they can discover new about the Rorschachs, and they very seldom discover anything new. What we see is, with one exception, the defendants at Nuremberg tested well within the bounds of normality and psychological health. They were psychologically fine. They were psychologically normal. One psychologist, after he reviewed it, said, all the defendants, with one exception, tested as psychologically healthy and normal, certainly much more normal than I feel after reading the results, because what he's hoping to see is pathology. And what he sees is well-adjusted, psychologically healthy people. The one person who tested as pathological was a man by the name of Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher was the editor of Der Stürme. You've studied the Holocaust already. You've seen those terrible anti-Semitic images. Most of those came from the mind of Julius Streicher. But here's what you need to know about Streicher, is before the trial started, the other defendants at Nuremberg went to their legal counsel and they say, we know we're going to be tried. We don't think it's fair, but we're going to be tried. But we don't want to be tried with Julius Streicher because he will make us look bad. So when a Nazi says about you that being tried with you makes them look bad, I mean, his co-defendants knew Streicher was cray-cray. That's no better than crazy. They knew Streicher was pathological. And the Rorschach shows it as well. Streicher had some deep, deep disturbances. Other than that, though, everyone else tested well within the bounds of normality. And what's fascinating is to see people's reaction in the 40s and 50s to this, because a lot of times what they'll say is, instead of embracing what I think is the obvious, which is these are intelligent, psychologically normal people, what does that mean for us? What people still try to hide behind is they say things like, wow, the field of psychology must be really screwed up if it can't find pathology here. Because if you can't find it here, you can't find it anywhere. So people are still trying to keep it at a distance. So the next piece we looked for was, well, if they're not pathological, then certainly they have a twisted personality of some type. They've been raised by abusive parents, they have mother issues, they have father issues. This has a strong Freudian background and history to it. And I won't bore you with the details here because, frankly, the details are pretty boring. But long story short, we've looked for this magic, what used to be called the Nazi personality. We've looked for decades for this personality type that you could be given a test. We can take the results of the test and say, you have a personality type that trends toward fascism, toward authoritarianism, perhaps toward the perpetration of atrocities like this. And this is just an elusive thing for us. We just don't find this personality type. I mean, we can do personality tests that allow us to predict voting behaviors and different things like this, but a personality test that enables us to determine who is more likely to perpetrate these atrocities than someone else, we just haven't been able to pull that off. And it's not been for a lack of effort. Psychologists spend a lot of time on this. So what it leaves us with, I think, is this, for me, realization. And it's ordinary people. And this is the whole thesis of my work. It's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide and mass killing. W.H. Auden has said, evil is unspectacular and it's always human. What he means by that is not that the effects of evil are unspectacular. Let's go back to that small Sunday school classroom in Rwanda. There's nothing unspectacular about that. That's extraordinary evil. Auden's talking about the people who produce the evil, the people who do the evil are unspectacular and always human. I think this resonates very much with my experiences. Again, 225 perpetrators, I can say 3, maybe 4 I've sat with, and I've said, when it's over, there's no point of human connection there. And that's not what I'm looking for in the interview. But 3 or 4 who I could say, all right, these felt like monsters. These felt like demonic madmen. These felt like people that I've never known and been around before. The other 221, 222, ordinary, unspectacular people. Very much like me, very much like you. Now, if that's the argument, that's ordinary people like you and I who do this evil, because I know, I've taught these courses for years. You come into the course and you want to be the resistor. You want to be the rescuer. You want to be the hero. You want to think, in this situation, this is who I would be. The truth is, most of us would choose to be bystanders. Some of us would actually choose to be killers, to be involved in the process of perpetrating these atrocities. So if this is the argument, that it's ordinary people like you and me who do this, why is this so difficult for us or for friends of yours to admit, to understand, to absorb? What's so difficult about it? What's so uncomfortable about it? Because we could be those people. And see, I always love being at Sonoma State. You guys are mature, you're bright, you're beyond your years. Many times at other places, this actually happened in Colombia, that I had 2 military people in the front row, and their response to this question was, well, this is terrifying because of what it says about other people in this room. And the guy actually in the front row said, because of what it says about this guy sitting by me. And he was kind of joking, but it was kind of wasn't. Their sense was, this is terrifying because what it means about everybody else in here is they could be a killer. But you jump to the heart of it, which is not just what it means about everyone else, what it means about me, what it says about me. I was in, as Diane said in the intro, I was in Northern Ireland for several months last year, interviewing former/current IRA members and former/current Protestant paramilitary members. And they won't meet together. So when I would do a talk or a lecture, I'd have to do it in West Belfast just for the Catholics, or I'd have to do it in East Belfast just for the Protestants. It was fascinating because I'd give this to loyalist paramilitaries. We'd have this discussion, and these people have killed. 30 years war raged in Northern Ireland. These are killers who've served time. And afterwards, they were very complimentary. They'd come up and shake my hand and say, that was great. That really, really helped us to understand the IRA, those murderous bastards, horrible things. And I was like, okay, it's Protestant paramilitary. I'm not going to push them on it, so I let it go. Next week, I'm in West Belfast, speaking of former current IRA. After it comes up, they come up, shake the hand. Oh, Dr. Waller, that was so good there. That's a terrible Irish accent. But they'd say, that was so good there. I really understand those prods now. Those Protestants are horrible people. You get me to understand them. That's very helpful. And when it's over, I'm going, yeah, that's kind of half the thing. But if you could also start to understand what you did and what you did, that would really be the most helpful piece. But that's the most difficult one. We're fine with this if it's about other people. But when it's about ourselves, that's what's problematic. The book is done well. People have enjoyed the book. We're going to do a third edition here in a couple of years. But honestly, if I'd written the book and no one had ever read it, which is a real possibility when you write a book, no one had ever read it, I'd say, I'm still glad I wrote it because of what I learned about myself, what I learned about the world in which I live in, and what I learned about myself and that role and that place in the world as well. Self-insight is never a bad thing, even when the self-insight is painful. I mean, this isn't a good one. This is not a great self-insight that we could do something like this. Still, it's a self-insight. That in itself is valuable, even though it's something that doesn't make us feel good about ourselves or about our place in this world today. So what I've tried to do, other people have looked at in similar ways. Tina Rosenberg is a Washington Post journalist, or was, who wrote about violent criminals in Latin America. And Tina wrote this in a preface many years ago. She said, I would have preferred them, after she interviewed them, to be monsters. And come to understand that this is not the case was disturbing for what it taught me about these people and ultimately about myself. I did not want to think that many of the violent are people like us, so civilized, so educated, so cultured, and because of that, so terrifying. Again, it's not terrifying if I came here today to tell you that the people who commit these atrocities, you've never met anyone like these people, and you never will. It's not very terrifying. But as Tina says, what's terrifying is that the killers are so educated, cultured, civilized, they're like us. That's what's terrifying. Jan Hatzfeld is a French journalist who also has done interviews with prisoners in Rwanda. And Hatzfeld was interviewing one prisoner who, again, he was pushing the question of how did you come to do these things? And a prisoner he was interviewing said, at the time of those murders, and this particular prisoner couldn't even recount to the court how many Tutsi had killed. He said, at the time of those murders, I didn't even notice the tiny thing that would change me into a killer. So if you've asked me what I've spent over 20 years working on, it is that I want to notice the tiny things, plural, that transform people like you and I into people capable of committing these atrocities. I've grouped those tiny things into three larger categories that have to do with how the worldview is constructed in a broad cultural sense. Secondly, how the other is defined. And then thirdly, the social construction of cruelty, the group dynamics. Because genocide doesn't happen because one person goes on a killing spree. Genocide happens because we have thousands of people going on killing sprees. So what are those group dynamics? So let's talk about each of these quickly, and then we'll finish off with some questions. Cultural construction of worldview. This is a tricky one because, I think sometimes when people have written about perpetrator behavior, what I found puzzling is they'd have these great analyses of perpetrator behavior and even some of the psychology behind it, but nothing about the culture in which they were raised. Nothing about the country and the country's values and all the things that culturally could have had an impact on this person. So I knew going into my search for the tiny things that some of those things were going to be cultural. And this is tricky because I'm not saying these are bad cultural characteristics. I'm just saying that if you and I were in a regime that rose to power and we said we wanted to commit genocide, what cultural characteristics would make it easier for us to recruit killers? So I think there are some. I think a culture that's very much focused on group-based identity. I mean, genocide is the elimination of a group simply on the basis of its group identity. Most often done through killing, but often done through removal of culture, language, tradition, religion, a lot of different ways we can erase a group's identity, and we've done that here in our country as well. So in societies where they already think of themselves in terms of groups, and it's how they think of themselves, to try and draw people into tensions between groups, that's a relatively easy thing for a regime to do because you already think in terms of groups. Now, the US society, we tend to be a bit more individual focused, but lately we certainly have started to think more in terms of groups in a lot of different and destructive ways. But in societies where group is a big part of identity, we worry about the tendency of a regime to start to recruit perpetrators. Societies differ in their level of authority orientation, their level of social dominance. We know, for instance, that when Hitler comes to power in Germany, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, we're looking at countries that had high levels of authority orientation, obedience to authority, deference to authority, a sense of deference to social dominance was a big part of the cultural identities as well. I think Rwanda's been a fascinating case study of trying to recognize that we do have an authority orientation, but can we work with our children to think differently about authority? Can we teach our children to ask two questions about authority simply? Is the authority legitimate? So is the person who's requesting me to do this thing a legitimate authority? And then secondly, is the request legitimate? If they're a legitimate authority, are they asking me to do a legitimate thing? That's a critical way of looking at what authority means in a society. And for many societies around the world, it's not a way that they're used to thinking about. And you may have come from families and schools where you didn't think about authority this way. Authority was just authority, and you obeyed what the authority suggested you obey. A second piece of the tiny things have to do with the psychological construction of the other. To me, this has been one of the, and this is something I'll talk more about as I work on the third edition, I think this has been one of the biggest factors in understanding perpetrator behavior is how they come to view the other in such a way that their killing's not just justified, but it's necessary. Early on in my work, I was reading a transcript of a Holocaust perpetrator, and it's a legal transcript, so it's terribly boring, but it's somewhere in the middle. The prosecutor asked him, "How did you come to think it was right to kill Jews?" And his response was incredible. He said, "It's not that I thought it was right to kill Jews. I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them." Do you see the difference there? It's a qualitative difference. It's not just okay to kill you. If I don't kill you, I'm actually doing something wrong because you're such a threat to me for whatever reason. So I think one of the things we look at as we think about defining the other is how does the other, them, become defined in such a way that their destruction is actually the fundamentally right moral thing to do. And if we don't do it, we're actually committing a crime against ourselves, and we're committing a crime against our own people. So part of this involves what I call now a moral reorientation. In the book, if you've read the book this semester, I call this moral disengagement. I don't like that term anymore because moral disengagement implies it's like a switch. You turn your morality on and off. And I get this question all the time. How did perpetrators lose their moral compass? How did they turn their morality off? And I'm convinced now, after doing more and more of these interviews, they don't turn anything off in terms of morality. What they do is they reorient their morality in a different direction. So I've never met a perpetrator who has seen themselves as anything but a fundamentally moral person. They're good people doing good things. And you push them on, how can it be moral to do these things? And what you realize is they are fundamentally moral, but their moral universe is just here. This is what they mean when they say I'm a moral person, is I'm good to these people. All these people over here aren't part of my moral universe. So for me to be bad to these people doesn't make me a bad person because they're not, I don't owe them that moral consideration. You and I do this every day. We reorient ourselves morally to where we say our moral commitment is just to family, it's just to friends, it's just to people from this college or this neighborhood or this group, and we leave out large stretches of people who morally could and should be part of our moral universe. Several years ago at one of our seminars at Auschwitz, the opening dinner is a formal diplomatic dinner. It's miserable. It's like 4 hours long. It just goes on forever and ever. and then they insist on a keynote speaker at the end of it. So I had found a keynote speaker who I thought would be good. Konstanty Gabbett is a Polish Jewish journalist, very well known in Poland. And I still love Konstanty deeply today because he got up at the end of this 4-hour dinner and he had a 2-sentence keynote. And we're sitting here at the grounds of Auschwitz. And Konstanty said in 2 sentences, as a Polish Jew, he said, you have to remember that perpetrators are fundamentally moral people, and what they did was a fundamentally moral activity. And he sat down. And I was just floored. I was so pleased it was 2 sentences, but I was also floored at what he was saying to these diplomats. And we could look out the window and we see the gates of Auschwitz. But what he's saying is, if you want to understand this place, if you get caught in the victim's experience, that'll only take you so far. But if you want to understand it, you have to understand that from the perpetrator's mindset, what they did was the absolutely right thing to do, and it was the absolutely moral behavior done for the right reasons. And Konstanty was saying, if you start to get your head around that, now you start to understand how Auschwitz came to be. This hit me last semester. I was with a Protestant politician in Northern Ireland, high-ranking politician, who had served, I think, 12 years in prison because he had crossed the street in Belfast from his neighborhood to the Catholic neighborhood because he was given intelligence that the IRA was in this particular house and 3rd floor bedroom, and he was to go up and kill the person in the 3rd floor bedroom. He broke in, went up to the 3rd floor bedroom, 6 shots, emptied his pistol into the person in bed, ran back down to his house. Later arrested, turned out he had killed someone's grandmother. She had no connection to the IRA. Just an older woman going to bed at night. She thought the safety of her home. He broke in and he killed her. And in the interview, I asked him, how do you feel with this today? How does this set with you, knowing you killed someone innocent? And it was amazing how morally he still had kind of twisted it back around. He said, I don't see it that way. He says, if it wasn't for me, we might have a united Ireland. I was fighting for my people, for the Protestants, and I happened to kill her, but it wasn't the wrong thing. It was the right thing for the right reason. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you start to see the moral gymnastics he takes to justify and live with what he did. Large part of that comes from blaming the victims and for their own victimization. You'll be most familiar with this because we see this happen very often with victims of rape and sexual assault. That at some point in the recovery process from rape and sexual assault, someone close to the victim asks what kind of questions? What were you wearing? What did you say? How much did you have to drink? Why were you there? Why didn't you go with these people? And all these type of questions, because it's terrifying for us to live in a world where someone can be victimized by rape and sexual assault for no reason whatsoever, even though that's what happens. We want to live in a world where victims have done something to deserve their own victimization because it makes our fantasy world safer. Perpetrators actually use this to a great extent. They blame the victims for their own victimization all the time, and they'll tend to do it for quite a long time. I can give you 2 examples. One is I only interviewed one Holocaust perpetrator face-to-face. I was teaching in Berlin in 1990. He was a pretty well-known perpetrator, and he agreed to be interviewed for a fee. Got the money, sat down with him, 45-minute interview with an old tape recorder. And I still remember 44 minutes went great. I mean, he said all the right things. Terrible what we did to the Jews, should never have done it, national stain on our conscience, I'm haunted by what I did, on and on and on. And I still remember closing the tape recorder, and he sat up in the edge of his chair, and he put his finger in my face, and he said, but you have to remember, they were going to take over the world. And this is 45 years later. How's he living with himself? He did these horrible things, but if he hadn't done it, the Jews were going to take over the world. That's the mental space he had created. Give you another example that's a little bit more, shows you how it doesn't have to be consistent with reality at all, just as that example did. we interviewed a group of Serbs who had participated in atrocities in the war, and we knew that because they bragged to us about it. They were thrilled with what they had done and the Muslims they had killed over the course of 92 to 95. And one of the questions we ask routinely is, why the Muslims? Because I want to know, okay, that's the group you targeted and killed. How were you thinking of the group? So we asked the question, why the Muslims? And the first Serb we had asked this question of, he said without hesitation, through the translator, he said, because the Muslims killed Christ. And I let it go because I thought, all right, sometimes you get crazy, crazy gets you, you let this one go. Second interview, Serb, why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. I mean, without any hesitation. And so I was working with a Croatian translator who's getting increasingly frustrated by this response because it just kept coming, a third, fourth, and fifth, because the Muslims killed Christ. What's the problem with that as a justification? Okay, we got two problems. You didn't hear a response probably. One problem is we've already pinned that one on another group. That's what we've put on the Jews. Unfairly, historically inaccurate, they've got that one. So there's a line forming over here for groups that killed Christ, and you have to get in this one. The bigger issue is, which we started to push with them, is Muslim faith doesn't exist at the time. And it's not close to, it's like 700 years off. I mean, it's not even close. It's almost 700 years later before the Muslim faith comes along. So we started to get, actually it was more the translator, started to get aggressive with the interviewees going, it's hundreds of years later before Muslims come along. They couldn't have killed Christ. And we're going, no. My priest told me they killed Christ, and my priest blessed what we were doing the night before the killing, and my priest participated in this particular case in the killing. Don't confuse me. I know they killed Christ. And the Croatian translator, at some point, I don't know why I didn't stop it, decided that the truth of the matter would be settled by Wikipedia. So he pulls up Wikipedia in Serbo-Croatian, and he's pointing people, he's looking, Muslim faith, almost 700 years later. And it's like, no. And we finally get one fairly reflective guy who says, okay, maybe we're off on the dates a little bit. And then he goes, but if they had been around, they would have killed Christ. And at that point, you kind of throw your hands up and you say, perpetrators will do what they have to do to blame their victims. Even if it's completely ahistorical and ridiculous, they'll do it because we go back to that question, how do they cope? One of the ways you cope is the victims deserved it. They had it coming, and I simply carried that out. And then finally, we can say that, as I said before, the killing happens in group settings. And so in these group settings, we have to pay attention to the group dynamics that are at play. So if we can think, for instance, if we have a box here, all the things that affect your behavior in groups, conformity, peer pressure, you want to be good at what you do, you want to be seen as creative, you'd like to be a leader in the group, all of you are part of groups where you feel some of those pressures. Now we take that box of things up and we bring it over here to a group of killers. What they do is different. They kill. That's not what your group does. But what I'm going to say is we take this box of stuff, we dump it all out here, and it helps explain their killing behavior. Conformity, peer pressure, creativity, brutality. They want to be good at what they did. I've never interviewed a perpetrator who said the first kill was easy. It was difficult. They had to be drunk or they drank afterwards. They pretended not to kill, all those things. The second kill was easier. The third was easier still. The fourth, easier still. And then at some point, they're part of a group. What the group does is kill. They want to be good at what the group does. And they become creative with their brutality. I struggled with this for years. I still remember a testimony from an American cavalryman in the 1800s who, it was after the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, and he said women were raped, and then some of the men took knives and they cut out the vaginas of women, and they took the vaginas and turned them upside down and stuffed them on their saddle horns as trophy. Some men were killed, and the testicles were cut off and emptied, dried out. the testicles sewn together and sent home as tobacco pouches, as gifts. This is not an isolated case. This is happening throughout a lot of the westward expansion in the late 1800s. Now, how do people become, and we hear with Nazi guards throwing babies up and catching them on bayonets. What's with the creativity, the brutality of it? Why don't you just kill as humanely and quickly and cleanly as you can? Part of that is the reality of these group dynamics, that groups are bound together by certain things, that groups have identified themselves as groups, that groups have socialized, and you've all been part of groups like this. And once you go through this group building process, you want to be good at what the group does. And in this case, what the group does is kill. And what this means is that the things come to bind group members together. So in Rwanda, when I interview, many of the perpetrators I interview are former members of the Interahamwe, groups of young boys, some as young as 12 years of age, brightly colored tunics, outfits, that did a lot of the killing in Kigali and throughout the countryside. And we speak to them about life in the Interahamwe, you can see they miss it. They miss the brotherhood, they miss the fraternity, they miss the acceptance, they miss the belonging. All the things they didn't have, this group gave them. Now what sucked was, this group that gave them those things killed. That was their job. It'd been great if they could have got those things in a group that did kind, caring, humane things, but they found those things in groups that killed. So what I've asked us to think about is to turn our attention from internal personality issues from monstrous people to demonic people, and I've asked you to humanize the perpetrators, to look at the external, situational, social, psychological explanations that we could look at. And we're going to go back here to what I talked about earlier, that when we humanize perpetrators, you have a tendency, you can feel your sway toward excusing, toward empathy, toward forgiveness, those things. I'm not asking you to do that. These are, you don't have to, that doesn't have to be the way we interpret this. We can understand a behavior without excusing it, without apologizing for it. If we choose to not understand it, we're not going to be able to prevent it. We're not going to understand how we can stop it. We're not going to understand how we rehabilitate perpetrators to try and bring them back into the societies they've torn apart. We can't go forward if we don't know how these men and women were built and the ways in which they work. So we're not trying to understand. We're not trying to forgive. We're simply trying to figure out what are the ways this understanding can facilitate prevention. Because we can still understand with one hand and the other hand still hold up moral responsibility, moral accountability, legal responsibility. No part of my research has ever been used. I've never used an interview to get a perpetrator a lighter sentence, to get a perpetrator off of sentencing. Now, sometimes I think in the beginning that's the purpose of the interview, and it's why over time I've learned I only want to interview perpetrators after they've been convicted and sentenced, because I want them to know there's nothing you're going to say here that's going to help you. I'm trying to understand how to prevent people like you from doing the things you've done. So we can understand, and we can still hold moral and legal accountability and responsibility. I think you've seen this book. Someone showed me the book, so you've seen the book. This is the book, Becoming Evil, so much more of this can be explained in the book, but I want to take about the next 10 minutes before we finish to answer any questions, comments, concerns that have come up as you've sat and listened to me drone on and on here. Yes, please. Good. If you didn't hear the question was, how do my understandings of perpetrators in these settings would apply to mass killers? Like, you mean like in a school shooting, for instance, like in Parkland? It's a great question. I don't make those connections myself, because I think what you're looking at in school shootings, for instance, are people who are acting alone, typically, individually. there certainly may be some pieces of this puzzle that help explain some of the mindset, but I'm much more interested in those situations where a government or a group in power has said to people, this is okay to do. And just simply by saying, this is okay to kill these people, they can go out and do the killing. So that's where I've confined my interest. Now, there are people who have written about school shooters or serial killers who've taken bits and pieces of this to apply. I read someone's dissertation years ago who was writing about Enron executives. Do you remember the Enron scandal from a couple decades ago? And they were using this model to understand business people who do evil, cruel things. That's fine for people to draw those connections. It's not been the focus of my investigation. So I'm always, I'm hesitant to go more broadly than I feel justified going. I've never interviewed or spoken or really done that much research into someone like the Parkland shooter, for instance. I think after 9/11, I was asked to write a couple of pieces on the terrorists who committed the atrocities on 9/11. Now that one, I felt like there were enough pieces of what I worked on that were applicable there, and I felt a comfort doing that. But serial killers, school shooters, business executives, those things, I tend to be careful with my reach on those. Yeah. Other questions? Yes? Oh, good.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that we need to stop a genocide when we can. So as of now, we hear our president saying things that kind of mirror what Hitler has said. So how do we stop something like that from happening?
Been good with you. About wrapping up here. That's a great question, and it's the most important question we could ask today. Because again, I spend a lot of my time in other countries, like Colombia, like Uganda, where a country says to us, we're worried about the state of our country. I was in Mexico 2 weeks ago. Come and help us understand the warning signs. And I've been doing that now for about 15 years. I now live in a country that should be doing the same thing for our own country as well. And so I think your question is, there's a lot of important stuff you're going to get this semester. To me, that's the most important thing you should be wrestling with, is not only what this means historically, what it means for Yemen, what it means for Syria, what it means for Burma, what do these things mean for the US? I'm going to go back to that slide at the beginning, escalation. Genocide doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of escalation, and in that process, there's a long, slow erosion of human and civil rights, so that at some point, a group who's targeted has none of those left. We've always had those struggles in our society. Today, you could certainly argue that in the past couple of years, there's been an escalation of that rhetoric, and now not just rhetoric, but of policy, federal, state, local policy, that if you took, I wrote an article last year, February 2017, a Center for International Law asked me to write an article assessing the risk of genocide in the US. So I used a recent book I wrote, Confronting Evil, and I said, okay, I do this all the time for other countries. I have 20 risk factors. I go to Uganda and I say, based on these 20 risk factors, here's where I think you should be worried, and here's a risk level I think you should be worried about. So I did that for the US, and this was February 2017. When I did that for the US, and I laid out the risk factors we were facing, if you hadn't thought it was the US, and I took all those things in our country, and I said, here's a Latin American country struggling with all these issues. Here's an African country struggling with all these issues. Here's an Eastern European country struggling with all those issues, but they were our stuff. You would say about those countries, whoa, they're screwed up. They're in trouble. They can't appoint a justice to their Supreme Court. They've got constitutional issues. They've got governance issues. They've got huge levels of social segregation, discrimination. You'd look at the country in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and you'd say, we should be worried. We have those same things here. And what frustrates me is when people say, well, yeah, we struggle with those things, but it's the US. This isn't a problem for us. Our country's founded on this. We're founded on genocide and slavery. I mean, this is why we exist. It's why we have the power we have historically, that we've still generationally kept today. So this has to be points of awareness for us, because every country that slid into genocide, I guarantee someone has asked that insightful question at some point. They've said, boy, it seems like things are going a little rough, and there's some people we're targeting, some people we're discriminating against, some people those human and civil rights we're starting to strip away, and then that process escalates, escalates, and escalates. And as the process escalates, this is so important, as it escalates, there's less and less and less you can do to stop it. What you can do to stop it is what you do early and what you do now. So the programs you're doing on campus, the programs you're doing in your community to say, we're not going to let human and civil rights be compromised in this way. We're not going to define us by who we're not, but we're going to define us more inclusively. We're not going to let policy go unchallenged. And I can say to you, living in New Hampshire, I love what California does. I mean, you guys aren't letting anything get away. And something comes out on Thursday, you're on it on Friday, filing a countersuit. So you live in a state that is trying to do some things to say, we're not going to, if we think, and I'll finish here, if we think of genocide as a week and the killing is Sunday, if you wait until it's Thursday, Friday, Saturday to try and stop it, you've got a hard job. You don't have a lot of options. If on Monday and Tuesday you're saying, hey, I'm seeing stuff happening in my backyard that I've studied about in the Holocaust and elsewhere, and you say, I can't let this happen here, in my place, in my community, in my college, my dorm, that's where the prevention is going to be most effective. So I would say if what you come out of this semester with is a sense of your responsibility of citizenship in the US and your responsibility to be attentive to the processes of escalation, don't let yourself be fooled into thinking it could never happen here. Absolutely could happen here, and it has happened here. Nothing at all will prevent this from happening again if we let it slide, if we let it erode, if we let it escalate, okay? You guys have been great. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish here.